locked in essentially it's ego, but it's not an intellectual conversation. It's a game of who is basically checking the right boxes in their own little confirmation bias to their own audience. And that doesn't interest me, but it's frustrating.
But you're also the best person on the other side of that conversation now. So there's a series of videos on YouTube. I think it's called "Merry Christmas, Mr. Islamist."
Mr. Islamist, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so it's just
it's
him.
still up on YouTube. You can watch it.
Him pitted against the people who are playing this game. Islamists and jihadists of various sorts.
Yeah.
And that Majid is meeting them on interview shows, mostly in the UK, where they're pretending to be more benign than they are, and Majid is finding the question that sort of pulls back the mask on the theocrat, and it's hilarious.
It's very funny.
Well, that one video that you published on your blog, I've sent to dozens of my friends. The one video where there's this guy and he's addressing this enormous group of people and he's talking about, is this radical Islam or is this Islam?
That was, I think, a conference in Norway.
Yeah.
That was just, these
Stunning.
are just straight up Islamists and jihadists addressing a crowd of seemingly mainstream Muslims in Norway, but he just by a show of hands, are we extremists if we think apostates should be killed? It's pretty.
It's stunning.
It's an amazing document.
And in respect to the way they want to treat homosexuals, apostates. The whole thing is this Islam or is this radical Islam?
Well, talking of ideology blinkering statistical data on the subject of homosexuality. So, in the United Kingdom, a poll was done last year asking. So there have been 2 polls gauging public Muslim attitudes towards gays. The first asked how many Muslims in the UK find homosexuality morally acceptable. And 0%. This is, by the way, by a professional polling company. It's not just some student that's devised a poll on Twitter. A professional polling company found that 0% of British Muslims responded to a poll saying that they found homosexuality morally acceptable. And then a year later, which is now last year, another poll was conducted. And that was an ICM poll asking whether how many British Muslims believe that homosexuality should be criminalized or remain legal. And I think it was roughly 52%. 52%, if my memory serves me correctly, of British Muslims said that they would wish for homosexuality to be criminalized. And of course, what does criminalization of homosexuality mean under Sharia and traditional Islamic jurisprudence? We know that it's punished by death. So this is scientific data from gauging, attitudes, British Muslim attitudes towards homosexuality. But the ideological blinkers will kick in and refuse to see that truth. And these aren't Islamists. Unfortunately, in my dialogue with Sam, we talk about this, that there are the Islamists who actively want to take over a country and enforce their version of Islam. Then there's underneath that, there's a softer landing of very, very conservative stroke fundamentalist attitudes that unfortunately have become widespread. And here is an example of it that is being gauged by scientific polling methodology that tells us there's a problem. And unfortunately, if one were to speak in this way, especially in Europe, one is received by my own political tribe, and that's liberals, centre-left and further. One is met with denial and called a bigot simply for relaying these facts. A quarter of British Muslims, when asked about the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, a quarter said that those attacks are justifiable. They sympathized with the attackers as opposed to the victims who were the staff at the Charlie Hebdo offices.
So this is what led you to be put on the Southern Poverty Law
Speaking
Center.
in these terms. And unfortunately, it's reporting polling data. And what it does for me is to say this is why it's so important to address these issues, to have these conversations, to try and empower those Muslim voices that are seeking to challenge these sorts of attitudes and carve out a space. And if one can do that with Catholicism in Europe and go through a Reformation and end up with an Enlightenment and end up with secularism in the West, what I often say is American liberals are very happy challenging their own Bible Belt, and yet we have a Quran belt within our communities. And if I'm attempting to replicate the equivalent of challenging the Bible Belt within Muslim communities, it means addressing these issues. And yet they grant to themselves the right to challenge the Bible Belt within America. And yet if we were to challenge what I call the Quran Belt in Europe, we're suddenly called bigots, and Islamophobes.
Is this static? Has this been moving? Has it been adjusting and changing? Is there any sort of a recognition that there's an issue with this?
So, the emergence of ISIS really did bring it to the fore, and it really did quieten some of the voices. It also did increase the hysteria from the far left, because they began panicking, thinking, actually, we're going to lose this debate. And that's where I noticed their labeling became even stronger.
Really?
But the emergence of ISIS did wake up a lot of people to the challenges we're facing here, because so many European born and raised Muslims went over to join ISIS. And of course, think about it in this sense, the most infamous and notorious execution cell that I think were erroneously called the jihadi Beatles in the press, because actually it really does. It's an insult to the Beatles, but it also diminishes the true horror of these guys.
Yeah.
They called him Jihadi John, but the ISIS executioners, basically, that entire cell of the media face of ISIS execution cell were all British Muslims. And that should tell you something, that we've got the worst terrorist group.
And educate. I mean, the thing is,
university graduate.
Like every variable that the far left wants to marshal to explain this phenomenon, like lack of educational opportunity, lack of economic opportunity, lack of social integration, mental illness. Like you can find people who had massive opportunity. I mean, it's like you were. You weren't a jihadist, but you were an Islamist. But you're a person who can basically play any game he wants. I mean, you're like he's somebody who
back to the Superman thing.
He can run for political office. He hasn't been elected yet, but he should be. I mean, this is the quarterback of the football team in this context is a candidate for recruitment to ISIS.
Think of it this way. We've got the worst terrorist group in our lifetime. One can reasonably say is ISIS. Right? The worst terrorist group, at least in living memory, is ISIS. And the worst cell in ISIS, the execution cell, came from a fully developed, for want of a better term, first world country, and that was Britain. And Mohammed Amwazi, the leader of that execution cell, graduated from the University of Westminster, was given, as a young child, was given political asylum by Britain because his family were Kuwaiti and they fled the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, the country that the West liberated. And he turned against that country. So he had every reason to like Britain. Britain gave him a home, gave him actually physically bricks and mortar house, gave his family on social costs. They gave him social housing. They educated him. He graduated from university and they liberated his father's country from an aggressor. And this man turned against this country that helped him and his family and his nation.
Was he captured? Or did he die?
Oh, he's dead. One of them has been captured, but he's currently being held in Turkey.
Boy, it would be fascinating to listen to his rationale.
It's not so. The other one, I forgot his name, but he was just interviewed.
Yeah.
You don't get a lot out of him.
Yeah. He was interviewed by a female Arab journalist.
Yeah.
Did you watch that?
Yeah. No, that was
what happened there?
Very sullen and dismissive character.
Yeah.
Wow.
He refused to talk about much. He said, these are accusations and allegations you're making, and I will wait to trial. In the end, he kind of cut the interview short.
He seemed a little put out that she was a woman.
Oh, yeah, he did. So as I'm looking at you now, imagine she's the interviewer, and she's asking me questions, and I'm looking in this direction, in your direction.
He literally never laid eyes on her. It was bad NLP.